Welcome to Legal Lines. This program is brought to you by the York County Bar Foundation. Our topic this evening is exceptional children in Pennsylvania schools. Specifically, the title is Identification and Evaluation of Exceptional Children in Pennsylvania Public Schools. My name is Tom O'Shea. I am the host of the program, and my guest is Zach Nachass of CGA Law Firm. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, Tom.
And Zach, the very first question I have for you is, what does exceptional children mean?
Well, exceptional children applies to students both with disabilities who may need some services to help them learn in the educational environment, as well as to students with gifts who may require opportunities for acceleration and enhancement in the educational environment.
So it seems like that's a broad spectrum. It's extremely bright, exceptional students.
It's students on both ends of a broad spectrum.
Okay. That would be like, I think commonly called gifted students would be on the one end of the spectrum.
Yes.
And the other would be children with some type of disability.
That's correct. Disability.
And that could be a learning disability, an emotional disability, also a physical disability.
Yeah.
So,
any of those.
And there are special programs in place for these types of students.
Well, both federal and state law require that students on both ends of the spectrum be identified and evaluated to determine what types of services they may need for either to allow them to access the curriculum in the case of students with disabilities, or on the other end of the spectrum, services and programs to allow gifted students to accelerate and advance.
Okay, so let's talk about how, number one, how do you determine whether a student fits into this category of exceptional students?
Well, exceptional students are students with an IQ of 130 or more and with equivalent achievement scores. So you're talking about very bright and very talented students.
And is there an evaluation process for someone to determine whether or not a child fits into this category?
Yes, on both ends of the spectrum, the identification of an exceptional child is done through an evaluation process. And that process can be initiated by a school district, or by a parent through a request to a school district to begin the evaluation process.
Is every child required to be evaluated, or is it only a child where they believe they could fit into these categories?
No, every child is certainly not required to be evaluated. Only where there is a suspicion of a disability on one end, or a suspicion of giftedness on the other. And identifying students who may be in need of evaluations can happen either through the regular screening that schools have in place, through testing or observation of teachers and service providers, or from the observations and concerns of a parent.
Okay, so basically a child starts school, typical child starts kindergarten, first grade, and teachers may notice something on either end of the spectrum, we keep saying. One being that the child is exceptionally gifted, bright child, may be faster learner than other children in the class. The other end of the spectrum would be the child might be not learning as fast as the rest of the class.
Correct. And if a teacher sees that and believes that it may be the sign of a student in need of special education or a student in need of acceleration, the teacher can initiate a process with consent of the parents to evaluate that student and determine whether the student actually qualifies under the law for services on either end of the spectrum.
Special services, which we'll get into in a little bit. But right now in the evaluation process, it would seem to me that in many instances the parents are fully aware of a disability that the child may have before the child begins school, or it's just obvious. I mean, this applies to physical disabilities as well as learning disabilities and emotional disabilities.
Sure. There are, as you say, certain disabilities that may be very obvious. Bear in mind that the existence of a disability does not necessarily make a student eligible for special education services. The student must have both a disability and be affected in his ability to learn by the disability. So you're right. In the case of physical disabilities, it may be evident to the parent, to everybody around, that a student has a certain physical disability. It may not be that that disability has an effect on his ability to access the curriculum. For instance, if a student has a hearing concern that is addressed through hearing aid or some other accommodation, and he hears as a typical student does with the help of that aid, that student will not be eligible for special education. On the other hand, if you have a blind student, it's quite likely, almost absolutely the case, that that student will require some assistance to access the curriculum.
Okay. And then with respect to children who may have some form of mental retardation or something like that, where the parents are well aware of it going into school, that they would automatically be marked as exceptional students, or do they have to go through the evaluation process?
Well, they still go through the evaluation process, and the reason for that is the evaluation is not just to determine whether the student has a qualifying disability, but it is also to determine what types of services the student requires in order to address the disability.
So the evaluation doesn't just identify what the issue is, but it also comes up with some type of program, or it lets the school decide what type of program is best to meet the needs of the child?
It is a necessary tool for the school and the parents and the child's entire programming team to use in developing an effective and appropriate program.
Okay. Now, identifying children who fit into these categories is something that is mandated by state and federal law, you said?
Yes.
Okay. There's a distinction between the state and the federal law?
Yes. The federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, applies to any state and local education agency that receives federal funds, which is all of them. But it only applies to the disability end of the spectrum. Pennsylvania's law is the piece that applies to gifted students.
Okay. You mentioned something when we were preparing for the show about something called Child Find Project. What is that?
Child Find. That is the term that is used to describe the school district's obligation to affirmatively identify and evaluate students who may be eligible for services.
Okay. When the evaluation is done, how is it typically done? Is
Well,
it a test, or are there different tests for different types of needs?
Absolutely. When whoever identifies the concern, whether it be someone within the school district or the parents, it will be a identifiable concern. For instance, I believe that my student's behavior issues are causing an impact on his educational and academic performance, or it seems to me that my student isn't hearing well. Whatever the identified concern is will dictate in part the tests and components of an effective evaluation. Evaluations will, in most cases, include some test, likely a test of academic achievement, a test of intellectual capability, a test of behavior and emotional status and health and well-being. In addition, there are less formal components that will be part of the evaluation, such as the observations of teachers, parents, other folks that come into contact with the student, and all of that will become part of the evaluation.
So it's important that every public school have a program in place to do the evaluations. Am I correct?
Generally, yes.
Is this a standard that is the same throughout every school district, or do different school districts have different ways to evaluate?
The district, individual districts have their own methods and ways, but generally a good evaluation will include the same components, and often a school psychologist will administer some of the tests, and again, it's all on an individual basis, so it largely depends on what the concerns for the individual student are.
And what we're looking for when we do these evaluations is determine whether or not the child is eligible for the special services. We'll talk about the special services in the second segment of this program, but who makes the determination? Is it just one person? Is it a group of people?
No, it's a eligibility and evaluation team. So once the necessary tests have been done and the other components of the evaluation have been gathered, a team will assemble that includes parents of the student, teachers, representatives of a school or school district, somebody who's qualified to review the tests that were done, and those people will look at the available material, determine whether the student has a disability or is gifted, and whether the disability, in the case of a student with a disability, has an impact, an adverse impact on that student's ability to access the general education curriculum.
And then they make a determination that the child might need the special services. What happens if the parents disagree? Do they have any input?
Absolutely. The parents are a necessary component of the eligibility team.
And Zach, I just asked you that question, but we're going to break for a commercial in a few seconds. So I'll take it up when we get back. This is Legal Lines. My guest today is attorney Zachary Nachass. Welcome back to Legal Lines. My guest today is attorney Zachary Nachass from CGA Law Firm in downtown York. Welcome back, Zach.
Thank you.
We're talking about exceptional children in Pennsylvania public schools. And just to briefly summarize, we talked about exceptional children being either gifted children, very bright children. I think you said IQ above 130.
That's right.
And also children with special needs that might be physical or emotional or mental conditions that cause them to have special needs.
Correct.
And all of these children under Pennsylvania law are entitled to specialized services within the school district.
That's right.
Okay. And what we were talking about in the first half is the evaluation process to determine what children are eligible and how to decide what is needed for them. And we ended with my question, which was, what happens if the parents disagree? The school district says, well, your child does not fit into this category and there's no need for a specialized program. Is there a place where the parents can complain?
Yes, there is. And certainly during the eligibility meeting or in any meetings involving the child, there likely will be disagreements among the team members. And and that is, in fact, the place for those disagreements to be discussed and potentially to resolve them there.
And one of the team members is the child's parents.
Yes, and a very important component of the team, necessary component, is the child's parents. Representatives of the school, other individuals with knowledge of the student will be members of the team. And the discussion both about eligibility and about services in the event that a student is eligible can involve disagreements, and many of those can be resolved during the meeting.
And if they're not resolved in the meeting, there is a process, a judicial process where the parents can go?
Yes, there's an administrative process for the parents to challenge decisions with which they disagree that are made by a school district.
Okay, and we're not going to get into all of the details of how that administrative process works, but it's something that would not be like a regular lawsuit at the Court of Common Pleas. It would be more of some type of administrative body up in Harrisburg?
Correct, with many of the same components that any court proceeding would have.
Okay. Now, can it be the other way around, where the school is recommending specialized services and the parents say, no, I don't want my child to have the specialized services?
Yes, and the school district has the opportunity to bring an administrative complaint against the parents in that event as well.
Okay. So with that, let's talk about where this is all leading. We have gone through the evaluation process. There was a determination meeting, a determination made that the child in question needs specialized services. They're eligible for them. What happens? What happens then?
Sure. If a student is determined to be eligible on either end of the spectrum, another meeting is convened. And this is a team of folks that's called a multidisciplinary team, or an IEP team.
IEP stands for?
An IEP is an individualized education program or plan. And an IEP is developed for a student with special needs, and a gifted IEP or a GIEP will be developed for a student with gifted and talented capabilities.
I think one of the things that's interesting is, that we mentioned this in the break, is that a child can qualify both ways.
That's correct.
You might have a highly gifted child, intelligent-wise, who still has some other, maybe a emotional issue or something else that needs to be addressed.
That's right. And an IEP can include components for both ends of the spectrum.
Okay. So how is the IEP developed?
Well, you assemble the multidisciplinary team, which will include representatives of the school district, teachers of the student, depending on the disability and the potential needs of the student, various service providers, whether they be occupational therapists, speech therapists, and the parents, as I said, are always an integral component of a programming team.
And since the I in IEP stands for individualized, each IEP, I would assume, is a little different.
They should be. There should be no two IEPs that are the same. And the nature of the IEP is to both describe the needs of the student and identify the services that are necessary to address those needs.
Okay, now we have the child who has an IEP. That child, most of the time, is in a regular classroom setting. Am I correct?
It depends.
Okay.
Again,
Is the goal to keep the child in a regular classroom setting?
yes, actually, there's a mandate under federal law to provide services in what is known as the least restrictive environment. And so, in most cases, the least restrictive environment will be the general education regular classroom.
Not to move the child out of the regular classroom. Is that fair to say?
Correct. The goal is to provide appropriate services for the student, and there are cases where appropriate services cannot be provided within the regular education classroom, and in those cases, the least restrictive environment in which appropriate services could be provided will be in something other than the regular education classroom.
Back when I was in school many years ago, that was referred to as special ed classes. Is that terminology still used?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so it might be a classroom setting for children, all of whom have IEPs, because they cannot properly learn in a regular classroom setting.
That's correct.
Okay, and generally these classes are smaller.
Yes, in many cases, I would venture to say in most cases, a special education classroom will have fewer students to a teacher.
Now, what about the children who go to a regular classroom but have an IEP? How does the teacher deal with it? What is required of the teacher? A teacher might have, I don't know what the standard classroom size is, 24? Might have 24 students in a class, for example.
Sure.
Am I right on that number, by the way? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a conceivable number.
You know the school law better than I.
Well, and
okay, and my children are all out of school by now. So, so let's say that there are 24 students in the classroom, and let's say 4 of them have different IEPs. What is required of the school and of the teacher?
well, let me step back and talk about the components of the IEP. An IEP must include a description of the student's present levels of academic performance and functional capabilities, an identification of the services and accommodations that are required to address the particular student's needs, and where those services are going to be provided. So we were talking about the setting in which services could be provided. That will be dictated by the IEP. If, in fact, the services can be provided and will be provided in a general education setting, the accommodations and modifications and services will be described for the student on the IEP. The modifications could be special seating assignment for a student, for instance, who has a hearing concern, cannot be placed in the back of the classroom, but other than the proximity to the teacher, doesn't really need any additional help, in which case the teacher implements the IEP by putting that student in the front of the class. If the student requires chunking of curriculum, in other words, breaking down of instruction into smaller components than would generally be given to the regular class, that's also something that a general education teacher may be able to do for that student through mechanisms available to him or her in the classroom. Another possible method of providing services would be to have a special education teacher come into a general education classroom and assist one or more students in there with learning. And again, that would be, that's known as inclusion services, and that would be dictated by the IEP. But it is incumbent on the school and the IEP team to put the student in a setting in which the providers will be able to provide the services that are required.
Okay. And sometimes the children get different assignments than the other children in the class because of the IEP, or a different test maybe than the other students?
That's correct. All of that will be dictated by the IEP. Some students may require additional time to take tests, given the nature of their disability, different structure, as you say, of testing components and so forth.
And while the child goes through the school system, is the child's need for the IEP evaluated each year, or how are adjustments made to it?
Well, another component of the IEP is that it include measurable goals and objectives. Those goals should be measured on a regular basis, and the individual or individuals responsible for measuring those goals or progress towards those goals will also be identified on the IEP. If there's ever a concern about the student's progress towards those goals, anybody can call for a revision to the IEP or a meeting of the IEP team.
By anybody, you mean the parents, the school, the teacher, the
Service
school
provider.
psychologist?
Sure, yes. So if the student's not making the progress that's expected, and the speech therapist identifies that lack of progress, he or she could call for an IEP meeting and ask that speech therapy be increased.
We only have like a minute left, but I think one of the other things you pointed out is as children get into their last year of high school, is there a program that deals with transitioning to either college or life in general?
Yes. Once students turn 14 years of age, the IEP must include what's called a transition plan. And depending again on the individual needs and capabilities of the student, that transition plan may include vocational education, college planning,
And Zach,
daily
I'm
life
going to
skills.
have to cut you off here. This was Legal Lines. We were talking about exceptional children in Pennsylvania public schools. My guest was Zach Nachass, attorney from CGA Law Firm. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.